Hello and welcome to our special election show, The Last Word, with me, Justice Malala. We are just 26 hours from Election Day 2021 and excitement is high as South Africa prepares for a new wave of leaders in its local government. South Africa has faced violence and trauma this year. In the middle of a devastating pandemic and lockdowns, the July riots and the hostage-taking of 3 ministers made all of us wonder just how safe our country is. My guest later on tonight is Minister of Defense, Thandi Modise. But first, we look at how the election campaigns were concluded over the weekend and what the results may mean for future elections. My guest now is Professor in Political Sciences at UNISA, Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, thank you so much for your time. I was interested in a piece you wrote earlier on in the week, and I'm going to get to that. But the first question I'd like to pose to you is this. There's been load shedding this week. The ANC rally was rained out. Everyone's talking about the smaller parties and independents. What is your assessment of all of the big parties in particular as they raced into the last weekend? Will it change viewpoints? Will it change choices?
I don't think what we are seeing lately in this last week, for example, is really going to change anything. I think most people have made up their minds quite some time back already. The way in which voters are voting to a large extent is not based on what we in political science will call rational choice voters or rational choice decision-making, based purely on the results and of governance, the record of governance, what parties are promising them, but rather on how voters over quite some time have developed a certain understanding of where they position themselves on the political spectrum and to what extent they support a particular political philosophy. So the detail, despite the fact that political parties very much focused on details during this election campaign, I don't think is really going to sway the positions or the opinions of voters, but rather what they believe in, what they expect of political parties, and what they think is going to be the possible future of political parties, and in which direction they want to move, also as voters or as citizens of South Africa, and where they want to position themselves. So it's very much about political identity. It's not only about political choice. And I think this is for political parties the big headache, how to move voters in order to get away from where they are, politically speaking, in terms of their political positions, in order to make more rational political choices ultimately.
It sounds like you're saying we're stuck in the past in many ways.
Well, it's the past, but it's also the future. Voters have over time moved away from positions, let's say, where they were in 1994 or the early 90s. We've seen it, for example, in 2016, how in the metros like Johannesburg and Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay, our voters did move away. How some voters did join different political parties. How, for example, the EFF was formed and they established themselves as a political force on the political spectrum. So it's not as if we are completely stuck in a position. But what I'm trying to say is that political opinions, political associations are not fluid. It's not moving around very easily. And election campaigns themselves are not very influential in changing those political commitments.
If choices won't change that much, will turnout be galvanized by some of the events of this week, some of the calls from the main political leaders and smaller ones and their campaigns?
Yes, political turnout, or voter turnout, is going to be a critical factor in this election. And I think this is going to determine to a large extent what the ultimate results will be. We've seen it in 2016 also, in the elections, for example, in Nelson Mandela Bay, where the voter turnout was in favor of the DA. Their voter turnout of their own supporters were about 10% higher than that of the ANC. And that really caused that the DA had more, in the end received more votes, not yet the majority, but more votes, that of the ANC. And I think now in this election, it's going to be even more of a determining factor, because we've seen how many ANC supporters are very critical of President Ramaphosa when he addressed him, and other leaders of the ANC also. And the real question now is, what will be the ability of the ANC to, despite the sense of despondency amongst ANC supporters, they will still be able to mobilize them for the election compared to other parties, and that is the DA very specifically, and the EFF also, and then maybe some of the smaller parties like Action SA and others. So this is going to be, I think, a major determining factor of this election is not so much swings in the political association of voters, but rather in the voter turnout.
You earlier this week wrote that in Joburg, Tshwane and Ekurhuleni, no, you don't foresee any radical changes. Do you still stand by that? Do you believe that it's pretty static in terms of outcomes?
Yes, I do. I think the election results in the metros will be very much sort of influenced by what we have seen in the 2019 national and provincial elections, especially the provincial elections. In Gauteng specifically, the Gauteng tendency was different from the national tendency for the ANC, the DA, as well as the EFF. And I think that is going to affect, for example, the results in Gauteng and with the three metros specifically. And I still do stand by that. You know, in a sense, South African voters and the voter trends are relatively conservative. We didn't have seen major or dramatic changes in these patterns over the last 10 or 15 years. And what we are seeing is actually incremental changes. And that is why, for example, in the case of the metros, it's not that the ANC lost and the DA won, but it's rather the coalition governments. And I expect to see the same again in this year. Maybe differences in degree, but not necessarily completely new radical changes in many parts of the country. The one sort of unknown factor is what I mentioned just now, and that is the voter turnout, especially for the ANC. If there's going to be a major stay away of ANC supporters, then it can have an impact. But in terms of the general trend, I don't think we are going to see a sort of a watershed event on Monday.
Well, many people were hoping for a watershed, but if we don't see that, it will be interesting. There has been a lot of talk, and you've talked about incremental change. Musi Mamani was on this show earlier in this week, and he says that he's aiming in 2024 for the presidency. What signals, if 2019 tells us something, and this election on Monday tells us a bit more, what signals would be a positive for him to make a run as an independent in 2024?
Well, first of all, as you indicated, is what will be the performance of the independent candidates. And what we are seeing in this election is a proliferation of independent candidates from about 800 to around about 1,500. What we are also seeing is a proliferation of small political organizations at local level. We are not going to see that in 2019 again, because this is typical of local government elections. So these small organizations will not participate in national and provincial elections. And what we are going to see with the performance of independents, and specifically independents, not only those who are associated with small organizations, will give you also sort of a preview of what is the possibility of independent candidates' performance in the 2024 election. My expectation is that independent candidates are not going to do well in this local government election. They didn't have the same sort of media coverage or the media exposure or the public exposure as some of the bigger parties. And this election campaign was very much one of a type of a national campaign that was used by the main political parties, and the smaller parties didn't receive much exposure. So and therefore I think the local and independent candidates are didn't have the opportunity to present themselves to the public, and therefore won't have a major impact on the results. And that will not be good. We know that for the national and provincial elections in 2024, the electoral system will have to change to include independents, and it created a lot of expectation. But it looks like our political system is not yet ready for really creating space for independent candidates as a major political factor for the future.
That's a very controversial point which I'd like to explore with you more. Professor Dirk Kotze, please stay with us as we go into this break. We'll come back to you.